intensification, actually, of how people have gone in very, very different directions. And references to isolationism and references to arriving late for the show have reduced, although they are still there. They're still saying they arrived late for the show. But it's someone sticking today guns with Lusitania again. But a lot of references repeatedly to Woodrow Wilson. Lady Swain gets a couple of mentions. Emergence of America on the world political stage. Talk about legacy, preservation of democracy, place of African Americans. There's a real kind of bifurcation, or kind of splintering out, which is really interesting, really satisfying. Actually, I think that lots of people have taken lots of different things away from today. I think the thing that I felt from this whole day was about how, if there was one thing trying to pull everything together from across the day, it's a new social forces temporarily suppressed, but not defeated. I'm thinking here principally about isolationism in the foreign sphere and racial politics in the domestic sphere. On the surface, things went back in certain regards to business as usual. The Yanks pack up and they leave Eastleigh and they return home. But you still see the establishment of new networks, and I'm thinking here, I'm really struck actually with what Quentin was saying about the transnational networks that were established by these robber barons, the Carnegies of this world, which chime very much with my own research actually on the British Empire, which is that after the First World War, the British Empire becomes a lot more ambitious in the kinds of things that it's doing. There's an expansion of the imperial state. One of the things they start to take a lot more seriously is science. And you start to get a lot more anthropologists and biologists and other kinds of technicians going out to Africa as part of the imperial endeavour. But they're getting their money from America. We find in Africa British officials, British anthropologists arriving in Africa who have been funded by Carnegie, have been funded by some of these other big laboratories. So kind of illustrates my point that things are reconfigured as a result of the First World War. But I don't know if any of the other speakers had any points they thought pulled everything together, anything that they thought was important to emphasise.
Why don't we hear from our audience?
Well, yeah, I should give that.
Wrapping up questions.
Yeah, I was going to give the opportunity to do that as well, absolutely. Okay. Let's take to the audience. Any observations or big questions that you feel need addressing?
Please remind me why we refer to Uncle Sam. That was a serious question because
John. Well, to my knowledge, I think it was a character sort of created in the late 19th century after the Civil War in order to actually contrast the United States with the sort of the British version, John. Yes.
But why Sam?
Can I have a word on that?
Yeah.
It is thought that, which obviously means it's probably untrue, that there was a fellow who supplied the Americans during about 1812, when they were having another of their little bites of fighting, with beef in barrels, which had got his name on. And I think it was Sam Wheeler from memory. And he was always known as Uncle Sam. And therefore Uncle Sam was supplying beef to the American troops fighting in, I think it was 1812. But as I say,
Right.
Who knows?
Well, it's a better story than mine.
It's older. That's all we can do. We can claim
One of the,
back so.
it's like that category of questions that my son asked me, a factual question I don't know, and I said, pause a bit, says, you could ask your phone.
But is your phone more credible?
So I guess I'm interested in, obviously, the whole topic of the impact of America entering the war. And there must have been an impact on Germany. So there's a lot of thought about the industrialization. Germany emerges from the First World War, we were just talking about it, relatively unscathed compared to what had happened in Britain and France. And I just wonder the extent to which the industrial machine of Germany was aware of or took advantage of what had happened with America entering the war.
I mean, I don't know whether it's true that Germany escaped relatively unscathed. Obviously, there's not a large-scale sort of bombing of Germany as it was in the Second World War. There's not an invasion of Germany the way that it was in the Second World War. But by sort of 1919, 1920, the German economy is a basket case and continues to be a basket case for a long period of time. So I think there's a sort of distinction that you need to draw between economic power, which is definitely suppressed over the course of the war as a result of declarations and so on, and the existence of continued expertise in industry and science, which definitely remains a source of power and potential for the Germans for a long period of time. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to sort of draw a distinction.
Yeah, I've discussed this with German friends.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that they became a basket case, obviously, were on the back of reparations and goodness knows, and what was the phrase, the guilt clause or whatever. So, I mean, the Rhine giants, the chemical Rhine giants, are more or less intact. Krupp is more or less intact. And they would have seen what American power would have brought to the Allies, if you like. And I just wondered the extent to which that might have influenced thinking coming in through the 20s and 30s.
I mean, the answer is I don't know. There is a reconstitution of scientific links between the Americans and the Germans over the course of the 1920s. There are a lot of conversations that are happening across the Atlantic about all kinds of different matters, sort of social reform, a lot of kind of progressive era ideas. There's a whole kind of conversation, even though they don't get embedded in the German system. There's a lot of discussion going on. So it wouldn't surprise me that those sorts of a process of mutual learning is taking place. And in fact, when we use the word isolationism to describe the American policy in the interwar period, we have to be very careful about how we use it, because in many ways, yes, there is a sort of a political isolationism of not getting involved in the League of Nations. There's certainly not economic isolationism in the sense that the American trading links with the world continue, and with Europe continue to expand. You go to Paris in the 1920s, read Hemingway, read Scott's Fitzgerald. There are an awful lot of Americans in Paris, to the point that the French get very upset by the numbers of Americans that are in Paris. Cultural isolation, again, no, this is the great age of, when the First World War has knocked out a lot of the film production facilities in sort of Britain, Europe, and so on. So this is the opportunity for Hollywood to seize the centre stage. So there's a lot of traffic that follows thereafter.
Okay, thank you.
I think one of the roots of this, and I haven't really thought it through properly, is the development of education in Germany as opposed to the development of education in England or France or America.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's a lot of interest, progressive thinkers. You think people like John Dewey, who's one of the kind of keys of progressive intellectuals of the era. There's a lot of transatlantic conversations going on with people like that. German research universities, I mentioned those in my talk, they've become the sort of model for what a lot of British and American universities want to do.
I mean, certainly amongst the senior, what becomes the senior Nazi leadership, there's not a lesson learned about American power, in that the declaration of war against the United States in the Second World War is an incredible strategic error, because actually, yes, the US is entering the war, but the focus is going to be on the Pacific, and actually make it very easy for Roosevelt to then sell this as the European theatre as well, because actually while Congress and the public are going to be behind this, the real focus is this is a war in the Pacific, and our war is with Japan. And it's that, you know, the declaration of war against the United States is a gift. And just another one of those. So if there's a lesson learned about American entry into the First World War, it's certainly ignored like that.
I do think there's a certain effort by German military innovators in the 30s to develop the strategy and tactics of blitzkrieg, precisely in order to overcow the French and the British and their immediate neighbors, in the hopes of persecuting some kind of peace settlement before the American war machine can really get ramped up. But I mean, I think Chris is right. It really is sort of beggars belief that Hitler would make such a strategic own goal as to, make it so much more simple for Roosevelt to justify intervention in the European theater. I mean, I think one of the interesting omissions that you have when we describe America in the 20s and 30s as being isolationist, not only the fact that whether Christian missionaries or commercial traders or just cultural flows that can continue to bounce back and forth across the Atlantic, the United States is also a Pacific power. And in some ways, American strategy as it developed in the first half of the 20th century was about fielding a formidable Navy and military presence in the Pacific, not in the Atlantic necessarily. And I think it's something you see somewhat in my presentation on the League of Nations. The United States always has one eye on the Atlantic and one eye on the Pacific. It has certain advantages. As Benjamin Franklin once quipped, it was the only country that enjoyed a weak neighbor to the north, a weak neighbor to the south, to the east fish, and to the west fish. Which allows it a certain strategic distance, and there are really no clear proximate dangers to American national security. But as a result, it always has to think in more global terms often than European nations did, even with the colonies.
Do you think the American film industry, which, I mean, we all grew up watching American films, tended to tell the American story to perhaps the world at large, it made it a very glamorous place to live?
Yeah, well, I think Los Angeles always looks very glamorous until you actually go there. Yes. So, I mean, yeah, and I think that's precisely as Chris and Kendrick mentioned, really the Hollywood star system kind of seizes the day, seizes center stage in the 1920s and 1930s, along with many other American forms of industry and commerce and even logistics. The beginning of the modern department store, the beginning of sort of modern advertising, which is also influenced by Weimar techniques. There's a real interesting and in some ways very controversial cultural shift of power in the 1920s and 1930s. The sort of Great Gatsby moment for the United States, and Hollywood is a big part of that.
Yeah, going back to the original question though about Germany, I mean, just looking at it as a simple economic question rather than the politics involved, who were their customers at that time? I mean, Germany itself didn't have the money to spend until the rise of fascism in a big way, and would the Allied countries actually have bought anything from Germany anyway? So, you've got big businesses, yes, untouched perhaps, but without customers. So what do? They just sit there.
It is one of the great problems that the Americans had to deal with the outbreak of the war, both in Europe and subsequently actually sort of going into the conflict in 1917, is that they no longer have supplies of things that they used to get from German chemicals, optical glass. These are really, really kind of key fertilizers, chemicals, fertilizers, for crops and agriculture. So there's it's what the First World War does is that it kind of domesticates a lot of production in the United States in those sort of areas. And so one of the things that the National Research Council, which I mentioned, was trying to do is to sort of provision expertise that can help internal American producers develop those sort of goods. I mean, optical glass is really important for a whole range of different industries, but it's very, very important for the military too. I mean, for sort of artillery sites and so on. And so one suspects, and I don't know, because none of us, I think, are experts on interwar German history, so, again, sort of inferring a little bit, but you can imagine that the markets that they survived off in 1912, 1913 were not something that you could immediately go back and secure your position in 1920, 1921.
Well, and they've also lost their colonies, and so they have lost these captive markets that have been part of this larger sort of imperial system of preferences, which the British and the French and the other European colonial powers victorious had held on to, and the U.S. had managed to pry access to with Wilson's championship of free trade.
If I could just follow up, it's a very interesting question, and maybe it's a topic for future research by you guys, but I think it has to be borne in mind that German chemistry was preeminent, that nobody in the world could touch German chemistry. In fact, Fritz Haber probably kept the war going by another 2 or 3 years with the Haber process. In fact, there is a school of thought now that says he should be stripped of his Nobel Prize.
Because the 1920.
Yeah, because the carrying capacity of the planet has been increased probably twofold, and 5% of the world's energy resources are invested in the Haber process to make fertilizer. So, that one man probably had an incredible influence on Germany's development, and I think it is an extremely interesting topic. It's actually German chemists who I've spoken to about this, that their chemistry was the leading chemistry in the world by a mile. We shouldn't have invented the process. Yeah, it's good.
United States being indebted to German banks.
Well, it's not just the German banks. It's European banks, primarily English banks, the Rothschilds, but others as well, to which not just the U.S. government, but really U.S. industries had borrowed from in order to create the manufacturing powerhouses that were competing with the European industrial centers. So it's not just German banks, although I would imagine since both Germany, and I'm somewhat referring here, both Germany and the United States were industrial upstarts who were, like China today, beating the Europeans, the Western Europeans at their own game by having lower, especially cost of labor that then were passed on to the ultimate consumer. The way in which they financed that was by going to English and French and Dutch banks and making the argument that they could build factories to compete in the global market. So I would assume that most of those loans were to the Allied powers, which is part of the reason that Wilson finds himself. It's just very difficult for him to hold the British to the same standards that he held the Germans when it came to neutrality and freedom of movement on the seas.
Okay, yeah, because I was just, you mentioned German banks. Was there something in that? I can fully understand that when the loans were to British, French, and Dutch banks, that the American, were then able to replace that with goods and manufacture. I was just wondering if there was anything lurking behind that on the German side.
There probably were, and Austro-Hungarian as well, but I believe at the time most foreign direct investment would have come out of first British and second French, with the Dutch playing a role commensurate to the size of their economy.
Well, if no more questions or comments, in terms of wrapping things up, I owe a huge number of thanks to a lot of people. So Mary at the back there has been very kind of instrumental in helping me put this together, and her colleague Tracy. I couldn't have asked for better people to help me working putting this all together. A huge debt of thanks to our fantastic speakers, who I hope you agree have done an incredible job of bringing this period of history to life. I've learned a huge amount, and I hope you have. So, and they need to be thanks for giving up their Saturdays for the greater good. But also thanks to yourselves. Your level of engagement and the sophistication of the comments and your thoughts and your willingness to engage in this is a really gratifying thing. So I love these days, and long may they continue. I hope you feel the same way. So, thanks all.